Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Louay Fatoohi. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, Paul. Thank you very much for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure and
Always
an
a
honor
pleasure.
indeed.
Always a pleasure. I'll just introduce you. I know most of the viewers already know you, but for those few who don't, Louay was originally from Baghdad in Iraq, of course. He reverted from Christianity to Islam in his early 20s. He has a PhD from Durham University here in the UK and has published extensively on Islamic studies with a particular interest in comparing historical accounts in the Quran with their counterparts in Jewish, Christian, and other sources. He's also interested in comparative Abrahamic religions in general, tafsir, the historical Jesus, and Sufism. He is a visiting lecturer at the Blogging Theology Academy. Now, to our topic of today. For nearly 2 millennia, Christians accepted the Gospel's depiction of Jewish authorities and the Jewish people more broadly as chiefly responsible for Jesus' death, with Pontius Pilate portrayed as a reluctant accomplice. Now, this portrayal, steeped in arguably deeply anti-Jewish sentiment, fueled centuries of Christian persecution of the Jews. In modern times, seeking to redress this damaging legacy, many Western scholars have rejected the gospel narrative completely, arguing instead that the Romans, rather than the Jews, were to blame for Jesus' alleged death. This 20th century revisionist view, however, rests on no textual or oral evidence whatsoever. It produces a striking paradox. The only surviving accounts of Jesus' crucifixion are wholly dismissed, yet the crucifixion's historicity is never in doubt. This podcast, inshallah, which is a completely unique, as far as we know, no one's done this before, it's a unique treatment. This podcast will explore this contradictory, incoherent, and ultimately fictional reconstruction of history. So, without more ado, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's very good and accurate summary of what we're going to talk about here. So the earliest sources that we have, obviously, on Christianity are Paul letters and the Gospels. Paul letters have very little really about history. Our history of the earliest history that we have on Jesus comes, of course, from the Gospels. Now, just quickly, the Gospels are known and have been known to contain inconsistencies, contradictions, also to have conflicts with Jewish law on capital cases, the Mishnah law. And on top of that, there are well-known historical mistakes in the Gospels. Many people have discussed those in the past. I've discussed myself and my publications, including my book on the crucifixion of Jesus. Of course, the Quran denies altogether that Jesus was crucified. But in this particular podcast, I am not going to deal with those kind of topics that people have dealt with so many times. I actually presented on your channel, Paul, a number of times actually on these topics as well. But that's not the topic of this podcast. So I'm not talking about the issues that we have with the Gospels. I am going to presume that the Gospels are correct or look at them within their own perspective. Okay, not rather than look at them from outside and say, well, that's wrong. That's so the focus here, I will be ignoring really what I usually do, introducing the Quran into the discussion, simply not to kind of dilute the focus here. I might refer to the Quran a couple of times, and also I will not be discussing the historical credibility of the Gospels that I mentioned. We're not doing that. The focus is, as you said and described, Paul, is the fact that the Gospels unambiguously makes Jews or the Jews the main culprits in the crucifixion of Jesus. Of course, there are unambiguous kind of anti-Jewish sentiments in the Gospels. Now, this image of the Jews being responsible for the crucifixion has been the standard interpretation of the Gospels, the way the Gospels were read, for until really roughly the last century, beginning of the last century, when it started to change. But actually, earlier signs were there in the century before, as I will mention it quickly later on. And but where we are today, modern scholars, Western scholars, all agree that it was the Romans who actually killed Jesus. Any Jews who were involved, it played a really minor role, and I'll explain why. And they make this claim. Why do they do that? Why do modern scholars, historians, theologians say that? Well, because they are actually driven by, they are effectively trying to fight off the long-standing persecution of the Jews that resulted at some point resulted by the Holocaust last century. But in the course of doing that, by denying that the Gospels make it clear, or by saying that, no, it was the Romans who actually crucified Jesus, what they're doing, effectively completely dismissing the account that we have in the Gospels. Yet these accounts are the earliest we have, and indeed the only accounts that we have on the crucifixion. And they will end up in this really bizarre situation that I called it the crucifixion historicity culpability. So meaning by that, you are presented with a scenario whereby the Gospels are dismissed, their account which blames the Jews or Jews for the crucifixion are dismissed, these accounts. Yet we're told, having dismissed just about everything, we still believe that the crucifixion is a historical event, undeniable historical event. It's really quite a bizarre situation. But the implications for this position actually goes beyond academia, and indeed even beyond the subject of the historical Jesus. I will get into that. As you mentioned, Paul, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time this kind of insight, if you like, or perspective is discussed in terms of what I'm calling this crucifixion historicity culpability paradox. So basically, I think we can move, Paul, now to the first slide, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there we go.
And okay, so just before this is, just to say a couple of things. I am going to look quickly, just to remind everybody, about what the Gospels say about the role that Jews played in the crucifixion of Jesus, and also what Pilate is supposed to have done. Now, I mentioned it quickly earlier that in the other writings, Paul's writings, which were at least 20 years earlier than the earliest gospel, which is Mark, there is really very little historical information. But the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus from death, of course, is the cornerstone of Paul's theology. But he gives no details, so we have to go to the Gospels for any details. But but Paul himself also actually assigns responsibility for the crucifixion. It makes it the responsibility of the Jews. In one particular instance, in his letter to the Christians in Thessalonica, and this is First Thessalonian, he goes on to say, he reminds them about the Christians who were living in Judea. And then he goes on to say, for you suffered, talking to the Christians in Thessalonica, for you suffered the same things from your own compatriots as they did, they being the Christians in Judea, from, quote, that's all quotes actually, the Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. They displeased God and oppose everyone. This is chapter 2, 14 to 15. So that's really a clear statement about what Paul believed. Paul shared the later writings, Christian writings, the Gospels, that it was a Jewish responsibility actually for the crucifixion. Moving on to Mark, whom we have on screen. Now, Mark If I get it here on my screen, yeah. Okay, so we just right. So Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, was written sometime after destruction of the Second Temple, after 70 CE. And the reason, like I say, I'm picking it up because it is the earliest. The others partly relied on Mark and other potential other sources. And what I'm displaying here on the first slide.
Oh, you've not moved to the second slide yet. It was on the first slide.
We haven't. No, we're still on talking about the Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion. So looking at this is all these statements are kind of a summary taken from Mark's account. And the account covers 2 chapters, 14 and 15. 14 talks about the arrest and trial of Jesus by Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities, the Sanhedrin, the court, the Supreme Court, Jewish Supreme Court. That's chapter 14. And then in chapter 15, then the scene moves to the court of Pilate. And we'll get to that later. And so these kind of statements summarize the story, the narrative in this particular sequence, actually. So what you had is that the chief priests and the scribes planned to arrest and murder Jesus. They wanted to do it secretly. This is reported to have happened 2 days before the actual arrest took place. One of Jesus' disciples, Judas, then went to the chief priest to betray Jesus and sell him. It's not clear why Judas did that. The implication seems to be that he became aware, maybe, of the plan, and then we thought, well, I might make a little bit of money out of it. So he went to them and basically betrayed Jesus. Then the chief priests are said to have been greatly pleased by the betrayal, and they promised Judas money. Then the story tells us that Jesus was arrested when Judas and a crowd, a Jewish crowd, which is defined as consisting of chief priests, scribes, and elders, with swords and clubs went there. Now, notice here, there is no mention of any Roman soldier. The whole crowd is Jewish. And then Jesus is replying to them, and I quote here, "Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me." He was kind of trying to argue, so what happened? Why now? And then he was taken to the high priest, and then the Sanhedrin, the 71-member Supreme Court, Jewish Supreme Court, was assembled. It consisted of chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. They were, and then he was put on trial there. And the Sanhedrin looked for testimonies. Now, remember that they've already decided to kill him anyway. So clearly, this was a kind of not real trial, a short trial. So they looked for testimonies, and they found contradictory testimonies, false and contradictory testimonies. This is how they are, by the way, described in Mark itself. That's what I'm saying here. And they indicted him for blasphemy. Now, the 2 kind of specific, actually, charges that were raised there is that he said that he was going to destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days he will then build another not made with hands. Now, this is clearly a theological statement. It's not really a historical statement. Nobody would have listened to this. If he said anything like that, of course, nobody would have listened to this and said, oh, he's actually threatening to destroy the temple. Temple was a huge, huge building. But the other kind of charges that what looks like he was indicted for, really, is that when he was asked, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? It's not actually, these are not kind of blasphemous, but here you go. He was indicted for blasphemy. And then all of them condemned him as deserving death. As you can see, the emphasis on the all, everybody, etc. The scene and the images are pretty clear. And then you have some who spat on him. He was blindfolded, and some people stroke him as well. And then the guards, and when they said the guards, that's not Roman guards, that's Jewish guards, temple guards, took him over and beat him. So as you can see, it was complete. He was indicted. He was sentenced to death. What they needed now is to go to the Roman emperor, the Roman governor, in order to implement that. So then, okay, we have the second slide now, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay. So here, now we are in the court of Pilate. And as you can see, it was the chief priests and the Sanhedrin bound Jesus and handed him over to Pilate. Completely a Jewish affair up to this point.
Mm.
And he was presented to Pilate with a new accusation as claiming to be the king of the Jews. And the Mark states, and many other accusations by the chief priests. For some reason, Jesus stayed silent. And Mark comments there and say Pilate was amazed. Not clear what that meant, but it looks like just amazed by his silence and not really responding to the accusation. But then Pilate, having thought about the whole affair, he concluded that the chief priest brought Jesus to him out of jealousy. And then he offered to release Jesus according to his custom. What custom? The Mark and other Gospels tell us that the Roman governor had the custom of releasing a prisoner on the Passover for the people there. Now, this custom is unhistorical. It never existed, but it's reported here. Again, not our issue, but I wanted to mention this in passing. So he offered to release somebody who was called Barabbas. He was an insurgent. He was somebody who was accused of murder. He was a political prisoner. So it was really quite surprising that Pilate would offer that. But anyway, the high priest wouldn't have that. And they stirred up the crowd to have Pilate to release Barabbas rather than Jesus. And then we have, and I numbered them here, we have Pilate going back again to the crowd, trying to convince them to release Barabbas, and they would go all, now it's gone now into a mob scene, crucify him. And then a third one, why? What evil has he done? Pilate argues. So clearly he doesn't have any reason to do that. But of course, they won't have that, crucify him. And it is clear, and Mark makes it clear, that, and other Gospels as well, that Pilate then agreed to do that just to satisfy the crowd. So he released Barabbas, flogged Jesus, and then handed him over to be crucified. So in a summary, the account in Mark is one whereby Jewish authorities, supported by a Jewish crowd, were really responsible ultimately for the crucifixion, because they started the arrest, they made up the charges, they indicted Jesus, and all they wanted is somebody to do the dirty work for them. So they took him to Pilate, and Pilate then, under pressure, so he reluctantly agreed to do what they wanted. Mm-hmm. That is kind of the summary in Mark. The three other Gospels share all these statements, really, more or less. But what I'm going to highlight now, they still have some notable differences. And the reason I'm going to highlight them, because you can see in those other three Gospels how the emphasis is kind of, they further stress the responsibility of the Jewish authorities, and also kind of try to water down the role that Pilate played in what happened. So if we move to the other Gospels, starting with Matthew. Now, Matthew deals with Matthew's narrative is in chapters 26, 27. It's actually the four Gospels are identical in that the arrest, trial, and crucifixion all happen in 2 chapters. So 26, 27. And what we see different here, or addition by Matthew, is the involvement or appearance of Pilate's wife. Pilate's wife apparently saw a dream about Jesus, and then she advised her husband, Pilate, not to do anything to this innocent man. So clearly, again, the emphasis on the fact that Jesus was innocent, and the Romans, not only the Roman governor, this time his wife as well, did not want Jesus hurt in any way, let alone crucified. And then the other point that it's a quote actually here from Matthew. This particular passage is probably the most catastrophic passage for the Jews in the whole of Christian literature, from its beginning to our day. And I read here, so when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that the riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself. So it's effectively nothing to do with me. And that physical kind of, it's like a purification ritual to further stress the reluctance of Pilate and actually his innocence. And then it goes on to make this kind of catastrophic statement. Then the people as a whole answered, his blood on us and on our children. This was not something, this statement was picked up in the 20th century and resulted in, the persecution of Jews. No, this is something that played a role throughout the Jewish-Christian relations. Just to give you an example, Origen, the 3rd century theologian and writer, when commenting on Matthew and on this specific passage, he says the following: Therefore, the blood of Jesus came not only on those who existed at that time, but also upon all generations of Jews who would follow afterwards till the end time.
Right. So in other words, they're basically cursed forever, the Jews, and this fed into some truly horrific statements made by very eminent church fathers like Chrysostom and others, the Golden Mouthed, and these were used. These quotes by Martin Luther at the Reformation, who was just as anti-Semitic as they were. And Martin Luther's words, repackaging these thoughts, were cited by the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials in defense of their anti-Semitic policies. So this has been part of the Western tradition for 2,000 years now. It's not just that verse, but that one, as you say, is the most egregious of them all in the Gospels anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So that is... just wanted to highlight these notable differences. Looking at Luke, what do we have here? We have an accusation that's put to Pilate about Jesus, that he forbid people from paying taxes to the emperor. Of course, that is in conflict with what is said, what is mentioned in Luke itself earlier. So clearly it's presented as a false accusation. If anything, Jesus actually encouraged people to pay taxes, as we will see. Another addition here in this version of the narrative is that Pilate, who was obviously in Judea, thought that because Jesus came from Galilee, so he was Galilean, so he fell under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is one of the sons of Herod the Great, who was king of the Jews when Jesus was born. So he sent them there, but what's interesting is that the Jewish authorities wouldn't have it again. They actually followed him all the way to Galilee and went there to present their case, this time to Herod. But the conclusion, the unsurprising conclusion, of course, is that Antipas found Jesus had done nothing deserving death, and he sent him back to Pilate. John. So with John, I highlighted here in the first passage two things. This is the first time in any of the four Gospels, or the only time, where a mention of any Roman soldiers is mentioned in the arrest of Jesus. So the mention of police clearly must mean Roman soldiers. Also, the Pharisees actually were never really in the scene of the trial, arrest, etc. I'll get to this point later. But in John, they are there. Just to remind everybody, of course, John is much later than the other Gospels and is considered to be more theological and less historical than the earlier Gospels. So just something to keep in mind. The other notable difference that I wanted to highlight here is that Pilate said to the Jewish authorities and the Jewish crowd, "Take him yourself and crucify him." Statement that you don't find something similar here. So he's effectively given back Jesus to the Jewish authorities and Jewish crowd. There's no mention of his soldiers being involved there. This is repeated in the same chapters later again. Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. Now, some translations of the Bible, like the New International Version, replaces "they" here with "soldiers." But actually, there is no soldiers. It says only the pronoun here. And because it's the pronoun, it actually refers to the Jews rather than to the soldiers. So in the NRSV, which I use here, as you can see, there is no reference to any soldiers. So what you have here is, I think if we stop this now. Yeah, okay. So clearly the whole narrative, the whole story, has an intrinsic part of the responsibility of Jewish authorities, and in fact, Jews at large, for the crucifixion of Jesus. Yeah. The Pilate played a very minor role, reluctantly agreeing to what they wanted.
Sorry, just to interrupt. And Pilate, in some Christian communities, I think in the Coptic Church, is actually a saint.
And Ethiopian as well.
Ethiopian too, a Christian saint, because he is seen as someone who has virtuous. He didn't want Jesus to die. He was against the crucifixion. So you go to even that extreme in some Christian communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I'll probably maybe mention something quickly about that, about some other Gospels slightly later on, just to give a more rounded idea about what happened. So the point here is that if you remove from this account the responsibility, Jewish responsibility, and replace it with Pilate, you really have to rewrite the whole story. You really have to redo all of that. The sequence of events, the main players, the who did what, who said what, all of these have to be changed. What are we left with is only the claim that he was crucified, period. Everything else is gone. So that theme is actually repeated in the book of Acts. Now, the book of Acts is believed to have been written by the same author of the Gospel of Luke. And in there, in the book of Acts, we find Peter several times accusing Jews, or the Jews, of actually being responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. In one instance, for instance, he speaks about the Israelites, and he says, "You killed the author of life."
Yes.
In another instance, he's talking to the rulers of the people and elders. So that's more kind of smaller, more confined, if you like, group of Jews. And he tells them, whom you crucified, referring to Jesus. And then in another scene, he's talking to the whole council. And he says, the God of our ancestors raised up Jesus, whom you had killed, again accusing the Jewish authorities of doing that. Then in Act, there's another significant statement attributed to Stephen. Stephen is the first martyr in Christianity. Stephen was talking to the council, to the Sanhedrin, and he says something. He says, which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one being Jesus. And now you have become his betrayers and murderers. So again, the theme here is enforced that it's Jewish responsibility. And it actually continues in apocryphal writings, apocryphal gospels. There's a gospel called but what you find actually, if you go kind of if you add apocryphal gospels, there's kind of growing anti-Jewish sentiments. As you mentioned, Paul, basically some have turned Pilate into a saint. So if you look at something called the Gospel of Peter, early 2nd century, you have Pilate declaring, I'm clean of the blood of the Son of God. You decided to do this. Now he's calling him the Son of God now. If you take also another called the Gospel of Nicodemus, also known as the Acts of Pilate, there's a mention actually to the Acts of Pilate by Justin Martyr in around middle of the 2nd century. It's not clear whether it's the same book, but again, here also, it's showing Pilate as having nothing to do with the crucifixion. It's a much longer account there. And as you mentioned, that he was even turned into a saint. So the trend is one of emphasizing Jewish guilt and exonerating Pilate. It goes on and on and on. And that is, but the issue here, though, and this is very important. If you read the literature, Western literature, modern literature, this kind of growing trend of exculpating Pilate and inculpating the Jews, so making Jews more responsible and exonerating Pilate, this increased trend, historical trend, so the later the writings, the stronger these anti-Jewish sentiments. This is used by some scholars, a lot of scholars maybe, to claim that, well, then it's all fictional, so that assigning responsibility to the Jews is actually fictional. But the problem with that claim is that, first of all, it uses historical fact that we see this increased trend, but the oldest, every early source we have says the same. It's not in as many different ways, maybe not as strongly, but if you look at the image in Mark, the oldest, that's what it says. We have no other kind of earlier account of the whole narrative. Now, there's an extremely important observation. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to build on this argument that there's nothing in the Gospels. The argument that if you deny or try to replace the responsibility or swap the responsibility between the Jews or Jewish authorities and Pilate, the more you actually destroying the whole credibility of the Gospels. Now, we've been talking about the period of arrest, trial, crucifixion, leading to crucifixion. But the problem is, if you look at the biography of Jesus before that, so pre-arrest, it talks about two things: conflicts with Jews and absolutely zero conflict with any Roman authority. Starting with the conflict with Jews, before Jesus had conflicts with two groups The one called the Pharisees, which we mentioned earlier, this group was concerned with observing the law. And the conflict between, most of the conflict Jesus had early in his career in the Gospels was with these people, because they accused him and his disciples repeatedly of breaking the law. Now, this is a different subject. He didn't really necessarily break the law. At times, he had different interpretations. We're not getting into that. But the point I need to make here is that the accusation of him breaking the law and his disciples was not considered, or is not considered, as the reason why he was crucified. So his conflict with the Pharisees did not actually result in his crucifixion. The other group that he fell out with is the Sadducees. This is much smaller group. These are aristocrats. They were in charge associated with the priesthood, in charge of the temple. They had close ties with the Romans as well. In fact, the high priest for a long time used to be appointed actually by the Romans anyway. And Western scholars generally considered the conflicts that Jesus had with the Sadducees as the causes of his death. He was arrested by their authorities. Remember, as we saw earlier, they made the case. The Sanhedrin is their counsel. They made the case, and they presented the case to Pilate to get him to crucify Jesus. He was accused of two things that scholars think that led to his death. The first one is the destroying the temple, when he said, I'll destroy it and then rebuild it in 3 days. As I mentioned earlier, when he's talking about a temple made with hands and replaced in 3 days with another not made with hands, clearly he's not talking about the temple as in the physical temple. So I don't think that has much really in it there. And nobody would have, no Jew at the time would have thought that he was talking literally. They might have understood this in a particular theological manner, but it wouldn't have been a threat to the temple as it is. But the second accusation, the second claim, is usually considered to have been the immediate reason why he was arrested. And that's when he entered the temple and began to drive those who were selling and trading there. And he overturned the tables, apparently, and the tables of the money exchanges, and those who sold doves as well. And he didn't allow anybody to carry anything through the temple. He called this the house of prayer and accused all of these traders of turning into a den of robbers. And then Mark, as we saw earlier, goes on to say, when the chief priest and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. So that's taken as the trigger that led ultimately to his crucifixion. Now, the problem with this is that this scenario is completely unrealistic, historically speaking, because the temple was actually a huge area. It was about up to 35, 36 acres. Exactly. To imagine it in today's terms, it's over 22 football pitches. Imagine it. Yeah, it's that big.
Someone's actually made that calculation. That's good. Yeah,
right. Well, somebody's made it. It's not me really, but it's that huge. And it was mostly what's known as the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles is the court into which Gentiles could be admitted, because they needed to go there. They were allowed, and that's very effectively where Jesus is supposed to have gone around, kicking all these tables and trying to let people leave. It's completely unrealistic. Just think about it. He's a single person, not even his disciples offering him a hand in doing that. He was doing all of this on his own. Yeah. And it makes no sense. It was protected by God. Anybody who would have instigated anything like that would have been arrested, on the spot immediately. And Jesus being at least wise man, he would have known this action would have got him absolutely nowhere. It might have been symbolic, but it would have actually achieved zero. And in fact, the Gospels say that that achieved zero. It didn't do anything. But it's even worse than that, because what he was supposed to try to stop happening was actually essential to the operation of the temple, because those traders were needed to exchange foreign currency for shekels for in order for the temple tax to be paid. Also, people needed to buy sacrificial animals. Well, how do you do that? That all was done there. Yet, apparently, he went about just kicking all these tables, etc., trying to stop the temple from operating. It's completely unrealistic. Now, what really concerns us more here is not the fact that these are not credible claims, the historicity claims, but the fact that both accusations concerns Jewish authorities, not Romans. I'm going to go over this theme all the time. You'll see that it's everywhere there. There's no presence for the Romans in the story of the trial, of the accusations, indictment, etc. So he attacked traders. He didn't attack soldiers. So it's nothing to do with the Romans. So again, what we're back to the same point. If we are going then to make, and this is, by the way, consistent with the kind of general story of conflict that we have. It's all conflict between Jesus and Jewish authorities, or Jewish scribes, Pharisees, etc. Nothing to do with the Romans. So if we are going to replace the Jews here, Jewish authorities, with Romans, and assign responsibility for the crucifixion to the Romans, again, we have to effectively discard all these accounts, replace them with something completely new. Now, furthermore, the Gospels tell us that the Romans were completely indifferent to Jesus, up to the point that Pilate is brought into the picture by Jewish authorities. He was not there. He wasn't around. There are only two mentions or two interactions mentioned between Jesus and the Romans. Okay, that's before his arrest, etc. One of them happened with a centurion or a Roman military officer. One of his slaves was very, very ill. He went to Jesus asking Jesus to heal him, and Jesus did. That's one encounter. The second is that he was challenged on taxes, paying taxes to the Romans. And he replied wisely, and I quote now, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." In other words, he says, don't get me involved trying to drag me into any conflict with the Romans. Give to the Romans what you've been giving them all along. It's nothing to do with God. These are the two times that Romans are mentioned in the context of a pre-crucifixion trial, etc., in the context of Jesus dealing with them. And in both cases, as you can see, there's absolutely no conflict, no tension, nothing at all. And I mean, that Roman officer, military officer, wouldn't have gone to Jesus if he had known Jesus being, somebody who anti-Rome. He wouldn't have done that, would he? So that's why I mentioned earlier that the accusation in Luke that the Jewish authorities presented to Pilate, saying that Jesus refused to pay the taxes, the accusation is untrue according to Luke himself, and of course other Gospels. Now, furthermore, if you read the biography of Jesus throughout, Jesus said and did absolutely nothing to draw the attention or alarm the Romans, let alone to get them to crucify him. He had no political activity. He did not advocate violence. On top of that, he was actually little known. The Jews had to alert Pilate about Jesus. He wasn't aware even of him. So he was completely unknown. to the Roman governor. And then the Jewish authority had to explain to Pilate why they brought this unknown man to him. So listen, just look at the scene. There's absolutely no conflict, no role for the Romans in this developing and growing and escalating animosity against Jesus. It's clearly all Jewish, nothing to do with the Romans. Jesus, as we know, was a peaceful Messiah. This is something everybody would agree on, as in Christians would agree that he was a peaceful Messiah. We Muslims believe also he was a peaceful Messiah. He did not claim or did not want to be a king as an earthly king and rule over Judea or anything like that. Now, admittedly, if the Jews convinced Pilate that this is what Jesus thought or wanted, then obviously Pilate would have gone really angry at Jesus and obviously killed him. But that's not. We know that the conclusion in the Gospels that Pilate was, reluctantly killed Jesus. So he did not actually believe those accusations. Also, if Jesus was indeed a threat in the perception of Pilate, Pilate would not have stopped at killing Jesus. He would have persecuted Christians after killing him. Absolutely zero. There's nothing there in any source to suggest this happened. So, what would happen if we then shifted culpability for the death of Jesus from to the Romans? Well, we have to discard all of that. Now, there's one argument that scholars usually use to say, well, it must have been the Romans who killed him, which is the fact that he was crucified. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, capital punishment. In Jewish law, you have 4 forms of capital punishment. 2 of them mentioned in the Bible, stoning and burning. So stoning mentioned in the, for instance, if somebody sacrificed for gods other than the Jewish God, they could be stoned. And burning. I think one case mentioned if somebody married like a mother and a daughter, a mother and her daughter. And in the Mishnah, there are another 2, which is slaying by the sword and strangulation. These 4, there's no crucifixion, which is why scholars would say, well, here you go. He was crucified. It must have been. And now, why would the thing is, the question becomes, well, why did they not kill him then? Why did Pilate get involved? The majority view, not everybody, but the majority view is that the Jews had no power of capital punishment. They had to take him to Pilate.
Yeah.
And if Pilate was going to execute him, Pilate was going to crucify him. It's period. It's just nothing else.
There is some debate, isn't there, but whether or not the Jews at that time, via the Sanhedrin, actually had the legal power under the Romans to implement capital cases as per the Torah. And as you say, most people think that they didn't have that authority. It had that kind of capital crime was reserved purely to the Romans. And that kind of makes sense, really, I guess.
Yeah, I think one major argument for me is the speech that Titus gave and when he besieged the temple, Jerusalem, and obviously destroyed the temple. He argued, and he was here obviously kind of criticizing the Jewish population, and he said, and I quote, "We, as in the Romans, had given you leave to kill those who," now I'm paraphrasing, "those who go into the Holy of Holies of the temple." Yeah. What I'm trying to say here, you can see that how specific Titus in his statement to the Jews were given the power to execute somebody if they go into the Holy of Holies, and they are not. This is the most sacred place inside the temple. In fact, the high priest himself was allowed once a year to go into there. If the high priest went to there, or at any other point, the high priest would be killed. It was this kind of sacred. But the argument from Titus' speech is that clearly there was limited power. It wasn't that they were allowed to kill anybody, and the accusations they had about Jesus wasn't that he went into the Holy of Holies. So going with the majority argument, I agree with that. They had to take him to Pilate, but obviously the scene of Jews egging on Pilate to crucify Jesus is just absurd. They petitioned him to get him to agree. Pilate wasn't a person who, Jewish crowd or Jewish authorities would kind of force him to do something. He was already brutal enough. He didn't really need much encouragement. And so what happened is that they petitioned him and he agreed. So why would he do that? In my view, there was one possibility is that he wanted to make an example of Jesus and remind everybody of what would happen if somebody bothered or annoyed the Roman authorities, and he killed them, just sending a message to everybody. The other possibility, also, this is realistic. The other is that he possibly wanted to do a favor to the high priest. Now, the high priest at the time is somebody called Joseph Caiaphas. Now, what's interesting about that is that, remember that the high priest used to be appointed by the Romans anyway, and he belonged to the Sadducees, temple authorities, who had to live and find a way of living with whoever was foreign power, if you like, unlike the Pharisees, which were completely isolated from all of that. And of course, we don't want to get into the others, the other groups who were more kind of violent, anti-foreign occupation. But what happened, what's interesting here is that when the emperor removed Pilate in the year 36, he also demoted Caiaphas from the office of high priest. So both of these guys were effectively dismissed at the same time. And what I'm saying here, I'm suggesting is that it is possible that, they had to work together because, the safety and of the temple was essential to the peace in Jerusalem and in that particular Roman province, of course. So it's completely understandable. But the Roman emperor actually removed them both at the same time. So that's one reason why he potentially had to he agreed to do for the high priest and other Jewish authorities what they asked him to do. I talk about this in more detail in my book on the crucifixion of Jesus. I don't want to get into this further than that now. But that's basically just to explain why they had to take him there. Now, everything I presented so far can only point in one direction, that the earliest Christian writings, sacred or otherwise, point in one direction, that Jewish authorities and a Jewish crowd wanted Jesus killed. Pilate reluctantly did that for them. Now, obviously, we then led, as you said, Paul, to really evil, horrendous persecution of the Jews in many different places over the centuries.
I just want to point out that anti-Semitism, in its true form, I don't mean just being anti-Israel, which is what it means today, but real anti-Semitism is originally a Christian virus. And if it did spread beyond Christianity, which arguably some people say it has in some parts of the world, that's because this is a new thing. But historically, it has its ugly genesis in Christianity. And for centuries, at the highest levels across the board. This is not a fringe, marginal view. This is a standard view. It goes right up to the Reformation. You see it in a particularly concentrated form in the works of Martin Luther. He was a vicious anti-Semite and advocated some horrendous military action against Jews and burning down their synagogues and so on. Quite extraordinary. So it's only after the Second World War that the Christian West has actually begun to confront this ugly history. This is very recent.
Absolutely.
So people have very short memories or no memories at all, and they don't actually remember the West's historic anti-Semitism. And now things have changed because of certain political events in living memory, really, and that's why things look very different these days.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you rightly said, Paul. After the Holocaust and foundation of Israel, I'll get to this more shortly. Things changed. So, how did Christians respond to this evil, the evil of anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism? There were two responses: one theological, and the other historical. So the theological is somebody has to say Christianity does not have anti-Semitism built into it. It's extraneous. It's something that was added, etc. And that led ultimately to what's known as the Second Vatican Council in 1965, and the declaration that is known as In Our Time, because that's how it starts. And if we can, I think, put back, please.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let me just get that up. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to just read what it says. Through the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. So it acknowledges that. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. So it's actually rightly exonerating the Jews at the time and also Jews of later generation. Yeah. The declaration goes on to say, in her rejection, talking about the church, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews, and moved not by political reasons, and I'm not sure about that, but let's say so, moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. So this is a pretty clear. It's complete rejection of anti-Semitism. At the time, the Pope was Paul VI. Of course, you can read actually the full text on the Vatican website. And it clearly rejects kind of the collective Jewish guilt for Jesus' death, and it condemns anti-Semitism. But notice how it starts by actually accepting what happened there, which basically saying that it was Jews ultimately actually who started this whole situation. But the problem with this account is this declaration. So this is Matthew, right? And we saw it earlier.
Yeah.
And what's happening here, we're having the monumental Christian doublespeak. So on the one hand, we are actually rejecting anti-Semitism, rightly so, and exonerating the Jews, most of the Jews at the time and of later generation, as all of that. But it's not actually dealing with the issue, the real issue, and the worst source of this anti-Semitism, which is that catastrophic statement in Matthew. Matthew is a sacred book. Supposedly, Matthew was inspired by the Holy Spirit, remember, when he wrote this. So what the declaration doesn't do, and I completely understand why Jews do not think it was sufficient, because it doesn't actually come out and say, and we reject a statement like this. And the problem with this is that the church is in a bit of a tangle here. On the one hand, the church that's based on the Gospels and the letters of Paul. On the other hand, it's trying just to find a way out of the situation where the Gospels say something like this. So this is kind of typical double speak, as I said. It's very kind of common in Christian theology, just like, the most famous equation, 1 = 3. So that's kind of falls into this category. Often also, Christians actually use this passage from the Hebrew Bible to talk about the fact that nobody should bear the responsibility of someone else, rightly so, of course. Parents shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their parents. Only for their own crimes may persons be put to death. So this is used quite a lot by Christian apologists to reject anti-Semitism. But again, if you have still this problem, for instance, with that, and there's yet more problems. What do you do with this? So these are two doctrines at the heart of Christian theology.
And can I just add another, if you weren't going to mention it, in the Gospel of John, which is usually seen as the least historical of the four Gospels. So the words attributed to Jesus in John are not usually seen as historically reliable at all. But it's fascinating. Jesus, of course, was a Jew. His disciples were Jews. And yet in the Gospel of John, Jesus, in inverted commas, refers to the Jews in a hostile sense repeatedly, as if he himself was not a Jew. And in a particular passage in John chapter 8, where he talks about the Jews, he says, you are of your father the devil. This is talking to the Jews, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature. He is a liar and the father of lies. So their father, according to John, is literally Satan. Now, I'm absolutely not saying Jesus said this. The gospel says he did. But as I say, the consensus of modern historians is that John is a much later gospel, last to be written. It's a highly interpreted meditation on the significance of Jesus' life and teachings for the author, the anonymous author. We don't know who he is. But clearly there you have profoundly anti-Semitic theology. It's not just statements about his blood be on us and our children in a kind of rhetorical form. Here we have a theological statement that the father of the Jews is the devil himself. And this is not just for that generation. It would seem to be a metaphysical statement or almost. So this compacts in and makes worse the statements that you've already looked at. And so the church has a really tough job, really, to get itself out of its own scriptures.
Absolutely, Paul. Rightly so. Yeah, this is one of the worst features, actually, when it comes to anti-Semitism in John, and the use of the collective labeling of all the people, all the Jewish people, as being Jesus' enemies, and using Jesus effectively to make those declarations. And so it's the same kind of. This is why I say the church is in a tangle here. Really, how do you solve this? It's just similar to other kind of, when it comes to something like, say, what do you do with homosexuality? And you find, again, this double speak suddenly, trying to accommodate the scripture and new standards and new, ways of looking at things, etc. And you end up in a situation making no sense to anybody, whether they are a believer or not.
On that subject, completely off the subject, I remember I spoke to Professor John Barton, who's an Anglican priest at Oxford. He's also professor of scripture at Oxford University. And he's very scathing of these revisionist attempts to pretend the Bible doesn't condemn homosexuality. So I thought that's interesting, because I knew he was quite liberal. So I said, well, what's your view? Oh, well, I don't agree with the Bible, he said. The Bible's wrong. And this is a surprising response, that even when the scholars know what the Bible says, even though the current propaganda is it doesn't address the subject, but even when they know what it says, their response is still, we don't accept the Bible. Well, we don't accept what the Bible says on other things. Why should we accept it on this subject? Seriously, this is what he said to me. So, you can't win either way. The Bible is going to be thrown under the bus, basically.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've read something by him about that. His book, A History of the Bible, is probably one of the best, by the way. It's fantastic.
Yes. Oh, it is. Yeah.
And yes, and you're absolutely right. That's his position. I'm more aware of it.
Right.
How do you kind of bring these together? I don't know. But here you go. It's the same situation here. You've got text that tell you otherwise. The text actually says that the Jews collectively did what they did, and not only the Jews at the time, the Jews are actually to the end of time, as Origen said or understood. And then you have also doctrines that are difficult to deal with. The original sin that everybody inherited from Adam, that sin, and the redemption. You have here So under one doctrine, you have somebody inheriting the guilt of another, and the second one, the redemption, it works the other way around. You've got somebody redeeming, atoning for the guilt of another, and yeah, that doesn't really add up, does it? But no. Here you have it. So now let me stop this for a moment. So that was the theological redress, if you like, of the situation of this anti-Semitism, etc., and how to deal with it. That theological solution was never going to be sufficient, though, because there are a lot of people who do not believe anyway in Christianity or theology, Christian theology, etc., and they still know that even if you made this argument, you haven't solved it, because actually the text on which your faith is based is actually anti-Semitic. So how do you deal with that? So there was demand that there has to be a historical refutation of the accusation, not only theological, historical. Now, the earliest we can, and that means blaming the Romans, not the Jews, for the crucifixion of Jesus. One of the earliest, if not the earliest, who tried something like that was Hermann Reimarus around the middle of the 18th centuries. Obviously, he's credited with really introducing historical criticism into studies of the New Testament, etc. And he said that Jesus was a political rebel, and why he was executed by the Romans, and again he argued that crucifixion was a Roman punishment for sedition, the point we made earlier. And then you had somebody like David Strauss, who came later, again arguing. Still, he said that, but still he agreed and accepted that it was the Jews who handed Jesus over to Pilate anyway. Things, however, changed substantially in the 20th century, as you, Paul, mentioned earlier. This is post-Holocaust. The consensus completely changed. Suddenly, we started seeing scholars. Now we're switching to scholars, because scholars are the people who discuss history, not the layperson. So in Western scholarship, we started seeing a trend of change where the old view started to be questioned, the view as in the normal interpretation, the natural reading really of the Gospels. And people started shifting the blame for the crucifixion from the Jews to the Roman. And how do you do that? Like kind of suggested by Reimarus at the time, you say that Jesus was probably a rebel, potential political threat to the Romans, or at least they perceived him so. So they killed him. And that kind of develops the story for you. And now it's nothing to do with the Jews. It's all between the Romans and Jesus. And now it is actually the overwhelming consensus that this is what happened, that Jesus was executed by Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate. And the reason, obviously, is political crime, that he claimed to be the king of the Jews.
Yeah, and not as Christians normally tell me, that he was executed for claiming to be God. They say, oh, they killed him, which is absurd, because in the ancient Greco-Roman world, you could claim to be God. You might be thought to be eccentric or even mad, but I mean, the Romans, attributed lots of people to be God. The emperor was divine. Plato was a god. A lot of great athletes and notable people were called divine. For Jesus just to add, if he did claim, which he didn't, of course, to that would have been just boring, really. So it's absurd. It's absurd to think that that's why Jesus was crucified. No, it was for the reasons. I mean, obviously, Islamically, the appearance was given that he was crucified, but he wasn't. But the allegation was certainly have been political, because that makes a lot more sense in that context historically, because he would have been seen as a threat to. We see a certain regime in the Middle East now assassinating journalists. Just yesterday, terribly on the news, hundreds of journalists, people who seem to threaten their authoritarian rule, are simply executed And that's exactly what we even see today in exactly the same part of the world, strangely enough, 2,000 years later. To get all political for a second, I didn't intend to get political.
Well,
there,
I think we will end up there, Paul, as you will see, because there is actually a dimension to it that is political. And so you're right. I think obviously he was accused of being political. And because of that's what I accused them of. And I think it's a good reminder to viewers here that we're discussing the Gospels within their own perspective. We're not looking at them from outside. We're looking at them from a Quranic or Islamic perspective. We're not even considering them historically as such. Right. That is what modern scholarship that we're discussing now is claiming it's doing. And we're discussing this endeavor, this enterprise by Western scholarship to actually change the blame for the crucifixion from the Jews to the Romans historically, in other words, to rewrite history. So, but why? Before we do that, I would like to say a few things about the research into the historical Jesus, because it's actually related. It's the broader topic here. Remember the following, really. We need always to remind ourselves of this when we discuss the historical Jesus and what people say about it. The sources we have are extremely contradictory. Even if you ignore the issues that they have in terms of historical issues or their kind of violation of the Jewish law on capital punishment. For instance, these are kind of external criteria to judge the sources. Even if you look at the sources within themselves, in their own perspective, without looking at history, there are a lot of contradictions. What that means, if you want to deal with this kind of literature, you really have to pick and choose. You have to cherry pick what to accept, what to reject. I always say I'm a minimalist when it comes to the Gospels, because I have to ignore a lot and accept a portion of it. But even if you want to be a maximalist, you have still to ignore quite a bit, actually, because you cannot actually reconcile everything. So let's move to the next slide now. Okay. Theology disguised as history. Mm-hmm. This is a quotation from Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer was a German polymath. He was highly critical of the state of the research into the historical Jesus in his time. His book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, translation from German, still considered one of the best and most influential books on the historical Jesus. And look what he says about Jesus, about the research. He's a figure designed by rationalism. And what he's talking about by rationalism, the Enlightenment. So things like rejecting miracles, etc. He's talking about the status and the state of research. Endowed with life by liberalism, he means here the kind of social justice values that were assigned to Jesus by researchers. And then he goes for the kill, really, and clothed by modern theology in a historical garb. I mean, that's pretty damning, isn't it? This is a strange and unique state of affair. I don't believe there is any other historical figure who would actually went through this kind of process. And I will explain further how. And to confirm that, I am going to quote one of your guests, Paul.
Oh, good grief.
Professor Dale Allison.
Yes, a great guy. I've oodles of time for this guy. He's pretty unusual amongst New Testament scholars. Apparently he's universally liked by everyone. He's such a nice person. And he really isn't a partisan guy. He's very honest and very wise. Oh, he's a Christian guy, Princeton Theological Seminary, very eminent professor in the US. But anyway, enough about him. I'm praising him.
And a very honest professor as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, he is.
And so, yeah, he's at Princeton Theological Seminary. And what he's saying here is quite interesting. It was only sometime after my book on Q. Q is the hypothetical source that used by some of the Gospels. So he's referring to that book. It was only sometime after my book on Q appeared in print that I opened my eyes to the obvious. I had created a Jesus in my own image, after my own likeness. Allison here is talking 1 century after Schweitzer.
Yes.
1 century. Effectively confirming what Schweitzer noticed. When was that? A century earlier. Yes. So this has become like a trend. Everybody is doing that. And this is not because it's not only kind of self-appraising, but actually scholars accept it, and everybody is doing that.
Can I just, I know it's very rude, but pause you for a second and just recommend this book by Dale Allison called The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus by Dale Allison, the person we're speaking of. This is one of my best, most favorite books written by an academic of all time. It really goes into this whole subject about how the difference between the historical Jesus and the Jesus of faith, the theological Jesus. If you want to investigate this further, it's not very long, but it's. I wish I'd read this as an undergraduate. I would have really would open my eyes. It's absolutely fascinating. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, not at all. The quote actually from that book. So it's.
Oh, is it? I didn't realize it. Oh, you just say. Of course you did.
Yeah. I just a reference really for people. If they want
to. This is the book you're quoting from, then.
Yep, yeah. Absolutely. So and just to make sure and that what confirm that what Schweitzer said is universal. It goes beyond any 1, 2, 3 scholars, and that Allison wasn't a one-off. Look at what another professor. This is John Dominic Crossan.
Oh yes.
I don't know whether you've invited him before or not.
No, he's very elderly now. He's
in his early 90s, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I didn't want to kind of burden him. But no, he'll be extremely. I'd love to talk to him, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, he's an Irish American professor, emeritus professor now at DePaul University in Chicago. Yeah. And so, what does he say? It is impossible to avoid the suspicion that historical Jesus research is a very safe place to do theology and call it history, to do autobiography and call it biography.
This is so true. I just say that although these quotes are very true, and everyone will give lip service to them, all the scholars are, yeah, absolutely true. But in practice, things just have carried on normally. I mean, nothing has really changed. For example, Tom Wright or N.T. Wright, he's an English New Testament scholar, very much alive and kicking, professor and whatnot. You know, he's an evangelical Anglican. And it's really odd in his work on the historical Jesus he produces is pretty compatible with an Anglican evangelical Christology. And, it just so happens his Jesus is very snugly fitting into his theology. But this is what normally happens, and nothing, I would argue, although these Dale Allison and Schweitzer are absolutely right, nothing has really changed.
No.
Actually. 1 or 2 exceptions. I would say that Dale Allison himself, I think, is so aware of this issue that his scholarship now tends to be, to a considerable extent, very independent of his own theology to some extent. But he's quite unusual, I think, in that respect.
I mean, the Dale Allison's statement here shows a lot of self-awareness, of course.
Yes.
And if you compare it with Crossan, and it's interesting because let me give you this example. So Crossan published a book in 2011 called Excavating Jesus. Okay. A.P. Saunders reviewed it for the New York Review of Books 2 years, I think, after it was released, 2003. People can check it out. Saunders wrote the following about Crossan.
Really?
It's quite fascinating. We're getting into gossip now, but it's really quite interesting. Quote, the model that seems always to have been in Crossan's mind when discussing Jesus is that of Ireland, his own country.
Oh, that's right.
Which the British conquered and colonized, exploiting the indigenous population.
That's true.
Now, what makes this, first of all, see how relevant. Of course, I mentioned earlier that Crossan is an Irish American,
Yeah,
and of course,
and pretty anti-British, by the way. And this is the
yeah. I mean, as most Irish, I think. And what's interesting, Crossan, even though what Sanders says, in particular, this particular statement is very compatible with what actually Crossan said in his statement that I quoted on screen. If he meant it applied to him as well, because we believe he is. If you look at his book, the book that he's referring to, is called "The Historical Jesus: The Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant." What does this remind you of? Well,
Irish peasant.
Right. So when Sanders made this statement, it received a furious reply from Crossan.
Who did it? I didn't know.
Oh, absolutely. And well, given that the whole enterprise is about using Jesus for self-portrayal, what on earth is this all fuss about? I mean, for us, people who are not good at painting, we don't really understand it. But you guys, you paint Jesus all the time, and you do this self-portrayal, so you just live with it. You said this, presumably it applies to you as well. So you go. So why did I put this on the screen? Because I wanted just to show the status of the research into the historical Jesus. And so when we discuss unfettered flexibility, freedom, liberty in changing what the Gospels say, understand it in this broader context. People have changed everything about Jesus. They've drawn him and painted him in whatever picture they wanted. So don't be surprised how scholars would actually change what the Gospels clearly say. Well, they do this all the time. And as you said, Paul, this is not a statement about any one particular scholar. It's actually universal. And what encourages people to do that is the status of the early and primary sources. The primary sources, this is why we will never ever in Islam have something similar done to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. Never. The Quran acting as a control. And then we have a lot of hadith. Yes, there are issues with times with hadith, with seerah, there are issues, but you have control text. We don't have the issues with people relying on biographies, nobody knows by whom, were written many centuries, well, decades, if not centuries afterwards, etc. We don't have none of this. So it's actually a unique situation. Had that figure of interest here not been Jesus of the faith, nobody would care. It would never have developed and happened. This situation is impossible, in my view, impossible to happen with anyone else, because people would just lose credibility, anybody who would do anything like that. But because you have billions of people who believe in Jesus, are interested in Jesus, you have a whole industry of best-selling titles, positions at universities, etc., and you do all kinds of research and produce that kind of a state of supposedly scholarly work. If you had said this about any other discipline, it would have been completely discredited. Nobody would accept anything. That's not history, is it? I mean, I look, for instance, at something happened 2,000 years ago, and then anachronistically develop it, kind of rewrite it in my own image. Quite absurd.
And just again, completely off the topic about rewriting the Gospels in our own image. There's an article in the Times, London Times, yesterday by the very famous writer, novelist, commentator A.N. Wilson. Is a very famous Christian. He wrote a brilliant biography of C.S. Lewis and Jesus, famously influenced by Giza Vermeersch and whatever. Anyway, there's a new Archbishop of Wales that's just been appointed in the UK, and she, for it is a woman, is a lesbian living with her lesbian partner. I kid you not. And A.M. Wilson, who's always been a traditionalist, Church of England chappie, this is yesterday's Times. He wrote an article about this, saying that not only was he very happy about this new lesbian leader, but he hoped the next Archbishop of Canterbury, there's a vacancy at the moment, would be a lesbian, because he said Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. and and you said a bit more than that. But this is such a reinterpretation of the historical text in the light of the latest Western sexual mores fashion. It's quite shocking that a man of A.M. Wilson's caliber should say such things, but it proves that even he is just a fashion victim of the zeitgeist, like most other people, apart from Muslims usually. And he's simply going along with the trends and throwing again his faith under the bus for the sake of just being, in tune with the latest kind of fashionable moves. But the idea, one of the things that historians have pretty much ascertained, including Dale Allison, who's written a lot about this, and so has Dominic Crossan and so on, is that Jesus was a Torah observant Jew, which meant that he upheld the Torah, the commandments of God, and one of which, of course, in Leviticus is precisely the outlawing of or the condemnation of all extramarital sex, including homosexuality. So it's just an appalling kind of a revisionist history going on by people like A.M. Wilson, and everyone just follows suit. No one sticks their head up on the parapet. Foul! This is a foul. You can't do this to Jesus.
Paul, we always talk about things called, when you think about teenagers, a concept like peer pressure, and we think about they get into bad habits. Well, adults are old teenagers. Exactly. So actually, it's the same. You are under different kind of pressure. We're talking now about how the Gospels were kind of dismissed. The account of the Gospels in terms of culpability for the crucifixion of Jesus was completely dismissed, replaced, changed by the whole enterprise called Western scholarship into the historical Jesus. Well, how did this happen? Because you have to do it. I mean, we'll get into a little bit more details later and see what had happened. So yes, let's have a look now. Let me move to something slightly different.
Oh.
So, I presume you
what's this?
Okay, for those who don't know.
Is there any more content to this?
It is. There is. Okay, so what is that? Well, there's a very simple fact, okay? And this fact is so important, and I wanted to kind of imprint it really on viewers' minds. I decided to represent it pictorially. Otherwise, it's a very simple fact. So this is about, imagine this pie chart representing all the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels.
Right.
All the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. There are two parts to this pie. So what are these? Scholars think only 18% of what is reported in the Gospels was attributable to Jesus. The majority of it is fabricated. The majority is fabricated. Now, what does that mean? I mean, what I'm doing here, I'm adding bits and, bit by bit information to develop this picture about the fact that there's hardly any literature that we can call reliable, credible, that we can use in order to understand Jesus according to the very scholars who study Jesus. And when you try and come from a completely different perspective and tell them, we have a book called Quran, says something differently, suddenly they come up all kinds of argument against the Quran, its perspective. They're happy when they reach conclusions that are they've been stated by the Quran 14 centuries ago, when the Quran says Jesus did not claim to be divine. That's what scholars today say. They're happy to do that. Anything else they would not accept. But look at that. This is not the only problem. It's even worse than that. So the Jesus Seminar came up with the Jesus Seminar is a group of scholars who studied the historical Jesus. And they came up with, they included, by the way, Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, Robert Funk, even Robert Price, the mythicist, etc., some other people. 45 of them or something. Anyway, so they decided and concluded that only 18%, less than 20%, less than a fifth of what is reported in the Gospels, sayings of Jesus, were actually said by Jesus. The problem is, and on top of the fact that it's already very low percentage, scholars, other than these guys, differ on what that 18% is.
Right.
What means the number of sayings you end up having everybody to agree Jesus said is even lower than that. It is this status of literature that scholars work with. And remember, this is their own labeling, okay? So they label the sources they deal with in this way, and then they use these very sources to develop history. Imagine if that was applied to any other primary sources in any other field. How many people, how would this become actually a credible scientific, scholarly discipline? Very difficult to see how. So for me, it's kind of a statement of as if the discipline itself in some way self-discredited. Because when scholars come out to say, we actually develop images of Jesus that we like, model them to what we actually, on our kind of whims, if you like, well, that's not really scholarly work. Now, admittedly, I don't want this kind of description to sound as if those scholars, highly skilled and very clever scholars, develop some basic description of Jesus. No, these are very highly sophisticated endeavors that use all kinds of arguments and sources and etc. But at heart and ultimately, that's what they are. That's actually what they do. And why is that? And why I was trying to I'm presenting all of this to show that the problem lies in the poor quality of the sources we have. This is why somebody like Dale Allison he's very critical of the criteria of authenticity.
Yeah.
As many people, because the problem is this: if the sources are so damaged and so unreliable, no criteria of authenticity can work. And a lot of people now abandon them. I mean, they became popular at some point in the probably 80s and then 90s. But a lot of people now just don't have any hope in these. So let me just okay, let me remove that. So what we've seen now is that the status of the research into the historical Jesus, even without considering the observation we're discussing today, is already in big trouble, actually. Highly unconvincing, doesn't sound scientific in any way. Mm. By changing the culpability for the crucifixion from Jewish authorities to the Romans, you just make things a lot worse, because now you've damaged that other part of the Gospels. And so it really, the research into the historical Jesus is really more about creativity than discovery, if you like. And what scholars end up doing is not being historians, because you find a lot of people who would say, oh, we're not theologians, we're atheists. Bart Ehrman, I think, says he's an atheist. As if they use this to say, oh, I'm not liable to the issues that other scholars who coming from more kind of Christian background or Jewish background, Muslim background, would be subject to. No, you are, because what you're doing your own version of Jesus without having those constraints. These are not historians, in my view, because what they're alternative historians. They're working with a genre of fiction called alternative history. It's actually, there are lots of it, a lot of novels, very interesting. So they look at what would happen if. So, for instance, what would happen if the Nazis won the war? And then that's alternative history. And there's actually there's I think a novel called, was it The Fatherland, I think, You might have heard of it, but yeah, that kind of. So basically, what you do is say, well, this is not what happened. This is exactly the same, because that's what the Gospels said happened. And what you say, nope, I'm not having any of this. I'm going to tell you, according to me, what happened. So that alternative history. Now, I understand, as you mentioned, Paul, there's a lot to be done in order to stop anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness. That's completely understandable, and that's a noble thing to do. But that doesn't mean you go and change all these sources. All you needed to do is to come out and say, you limit that and say, well, what happened? Whatever role Jews played at the time was at the time. It had nothing to do with other Jews at the time or later generations, etc. And that is that. But that, as I mentioned, you can be dealt with only at the historical level, not at the theological level, because theologically you have a problem with the sources themselves. How do you, you can't empty those sources out of these statements. So the response to kind of the rejection of anti-Semitism was kind of irrational, really, at times, and unreasonable. And of course, the abuse of this, the drive to fight anti-Semitism, is all too familiar today, unfortunately. If you call genocide, you're called anti-Semitic. If you call extermination by starvation for what it is, you're called anti-Semitic. If you accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing, you're anti-Semitic. It's exactly the same kind of method. It's a bullying method in this case. In that other case, it's just they're going too far and completely unnecessarily too far to replace history. So this is what I call now the crucifixion historicity culpability paradox. It's a paradox because the earliest sources we have, all the Gospels, and they are the earliest sources, give us a harmonious account of the responsibility for the crucifixion. Jewish authorities, supported by Jewish crowds, and the Roman governor was only kind of an accessory and really reluctantly, if you like. And but then scholars went all-out war on the Gospels, rewrote the crucifixion narrative. In the course of doing that, they actually damaged the narrative in the Gospels. They created an alternative that's completely irreconcilable with the early parts of the biography of the Gospels. So they damaged the whole story itself. And they effectively broke the back of the Gospel narrative. And with no proof, because the alternative they gave us has no textual or oral support. So you can't go back and say, oh, I've got an alternative view about what happened, and this is my source. And I think this source is more reliable than the Gospels. That source does not exist. It actually was created in the 20th century, more or less. This is why this is a problem, and they reject how, why, where, etc. All of that in order to replace the current the Gospel accounts. Now, for us Muslims, there's something significant here. Nothing of the claim of about the historicity of the crucifixion is now left. Absolutely nothing. You've got like just a claim, just that one source, one claim, one statement: Jesus was crucified. Every detail about that event is now doubted, replaced, rewritten. If you do that with any historical claim, nobody in their right mind would continue to argue this is historical. Absolutely no way. And I keep on saying this is an industry. It has a long tradition behind it. It's nothing to do with scholarly honesty. Absolutely not. And anybody, in my view, should at least say, how would that go this further natural step and say, given that we are doubting everything about the Gospels, what's left? We might as well just doubt the fact that he was crucified. At least come out and say this is actually a possibility. Don't say I agree and I think he was not crucified. You don't need to say that, but you do have to say I don't have any reason to insist that the crucifixion is a historical event. Yet, across the board, nobody would say he was not crucified. In fact, scholars always say there are two events in the biography of Jesus that cannot be denied: his baptism by John and the crucifixion. However, given what was presented so far, I think it's fair to say the position taken by all Western scholars now is incoherent, preposterous, and in my view, is completely irrational. But why do they do that? You ask yourself, these are really strong words. How can people get into that? Well, think of it as a faith. People are conditioned, people born into it. When you become, if you want to become a scholar of the historical Jesus, right? New Testament studies, whatever, you join a system, you join a culture, you join an environment, and you work within. If you want to succeed, if you want to get published, you want to get positions, you have actually to meet the set criteria, explicit or implicit. People are conditioned. Don't see this. For me, when I talk about it, it looks like obvious. What's that? I mean, you just emptied the gospel of everything, and you're telling me you have to believe that there was a crucifixion. No, there wasn't. You've just removed everything. But that's the conditioning so this is why, in my view, rejecting what the Quran says about the crucifixion, at its dismissal of the crucifixion, the historicity of the crucifixion, on the basis of the New Testament, is completely baseless, only it's prejudicial and arbitrary. It really is. So now, how did we get to this point? Is it possible? It's kind of, it sounds irrational when you talk about the response to anti-Semitism causing this kind of paradox. How did we get there? And I want to introduce another dimension in the discussion here. Can we put back, please, Paul, thank you. So I'm calling this the historical Jesus of Israel. And what I'm talking about is the role of Israel, the state, if you like. This is kind of a term I've chosen, but it's kind of a broader concept about how its role, how it played a role in the construction of the historical Jesus. Not that we have one historical Jesus, but the specific issue we're talking about here, which is how the responsibility for the crucifixion was actually changed. This is taken from an article by somebody who's a professor at Cambridge called James Crossley. And in this quote, what I'm trying to pick out, so let me read that. Embedded anti-Jewish and even anti-Semitic trends in Protestant-dominated New Testament studies and the dominance of anachronistic law versus gospel approach to Christian origins. What he's talking about here is this concept that Christians or Christianity positioned itself as higher, better, more superior than Judaism, because Judaism is called legalistic. So it's based on work. So you gain God's satisfaction by following the law, living in a particular way, whereas obviously that was replaced by Paul and other Christians and adopted by Christianity by what's known as grace theology. Grace theology is looked at, and what's interesting about this quote, and I respect, by the way, the scholar here, James Crossley, but I think what I'm picking on here is something that I find absolutely incredible. That the fact that the Christians' labeling of Christian theology or salvation by grace to be higher or superior than legalism or work-based theology, which is what Judaism is, considered anti-Semitic in some way. It's been labeled now in that. So basically, somebody like E.P. Saunders spent a whole career trying to change that, trying to prove, in fact, and this is a different subject I don't want to get into now, with his new perspective on Paul. And the reason he wanted to make it this is actually what Judaism was about. It wasn't actually legalistic, etc. Now, we all, when we choose a faith, we don't choose it because, oh, I bumped into it and I'm stuck with it and I don't know what to do about it. If you ask somebody why you're a Muslim, you're a Jew, you're whatever, atheist, they tell you that this is the best, system I have, belief I have, faith I have. So when you say I'm a Muslim or a Christian, I don't take it as an insult to me. If a Christian said, well, I'm a Christian because I think Christianity is better than Islam. Well, that's his view. That's his faith. That's his belief. In the same way, I believe the same about Islam. Now, what's happening here is that the fact that the claim that Christianity superseded Judaism, so it's better than Judaism, is now considered defamatory. It's kind of labeled in there. And if you look at this statement by Crossley, look at where it appears. And actually, when you read about the literature there, that's exactly what it is. People consider it as an accusation and something you should move away from. Judaism is much more than the law. Of course, it's more than the law. If anything, actually, I would go further and say Judaism is actually better than Christianity when it comes to that. So what's that? Well, that's my view. You can't stop me now and say, well, you're anti-Christian because you say that. I'm not. So that's one. And from the same article, and that's, by the way, the article for reference for those who would want to follow. So then goes on to say, from criticism emerged in Germany at approximately the same time as Nazi fascism and its accompanying anti-Semitism, German New Testament scholarship was also providing some prominent anti-Semitic and Nazi supporting scholars. He mentions names I've removed, with the scholarship riddled with anti-Semitism, including the early volumes of the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament.
Which is the standard work, by the way. The TDNT is the standard academic work. It was created by Nazi scholars. You couldn't make this up, and it's still highly respected today.
It is really. I mean, I find this quite. What he's talking about is obviously there's a connection between, German scholars, if you like, and Protestant Christianity, and the rise of anti-Semitism and the presence of anti-Semitism in Christian theological work. And the argument here is that after after the Holocaust, there was a shift in scholarship from Germany to North America and the UK/Ireland. And as a result of that, the attitude toward Judaism changed in Western scholarship. And ultimately, anti-Semitic statements and anti-Semitic sentiments gradually started to disappear.
Yeah.
And which is, of course, that's what happened. And then I've got another quote also from James Crossley, but from a different book. This book was very interesting because he makes an argument, and I agree with to a large extent. He says, it is the broader cultural and political shifts increasingly supportive of Israeli state policy since 1967 that has partially created the context in which the emphatically Jewish Jesus could emerge and be accepted widely in the discipline. Such a pro-Israeli line is so deeply embedded in the discourse and mechanisms of American capitalism that it is unthinkable that there would be no impact on biblical studies as a whole, including historical Jesus studies and study of Christian origins. I find this really powerful really powerful argument. He, by the way, argues that after 1967, this particular trend increased in the, putting more emphasis on the Jewish identity of Jesus, etc. Started after 1967, and I agree with him with all of that. But I think the roots of that goes further before then. I think in 1967, of course, the Arab states lost the war against Israel, and Israel took obviously control of eastern Jerusalem, and what that created an image that's very vivid in the mind of in the Zionist mind, and that speeded up kind of the move in that direction. And in fact, in the third quest for the historical Jesus, we ended up with Jewish identity is completely accepted. Nobody would argue that Jesus was anything other than a Jew. And so I agree with that in general terms, but I think the roots are deeper, and it's always look for the Z word, Zionism. And even secular scholars, by the way, think about it, why would an atheist or secular scholar be influenced by that? As I said, it's a Zionism conditioned environment. You're actually working within that. So don't tell me you're an atheist and tell me because I'm an atheist, I'm not subject to that. It makes no sense. Absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. Of course, there are dissenting voices in Western scholarship.
Jeremy Crossley himself, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. So that's, let me move to slightly different thing. So this is taken, this quote, from Raymond Brown. He died the late 1998.
Yeah, I had the privilege of hearing him lecture at Oxford. Actually, he was an extraordinary guy. Yeah, no, it's a silly story. Sorry, this is just a light relief. I visited Oxford. I wasn't a student there. I was just visiting to hear him talk, and I couldn't locate the college that he had been advertised to speak at. So I popped into Campion Hall, which is a college of Oxford University, a Catholic college, because I was a Catholic at the time, asking the way to the college. And Raymond Brown was there because he was a Roman Catholic priest, actually, from New York. He was a very eminent professor at a seminary there, and probably the 20th century's leading Johannine scholar. And he was actually there. He said, "Oh, I'll take you there." So he and I and a friend of mine were students at Heathrow, walked through the streets of Oxford with this great scholar for 20 minutes. And we had him to ourselves. And so we went into, I forget which college he lectured at, and we walked in. Of course, he walked into a particular door going into the college, which went straight onto the platform in front of hundreds and hundreds of dignitaries, and leading, including people like Owen Chadwick, the famous Oxford historian. So we quickly dashed off, so we weren't in any way included with him. But that's my sad little story, just because I met him, and he was a very nice guy, actually.
And he's very was very well known, highly respected, and his book actually that I quote from here is also a highly regarded book. But look what he says when he was talking.
He wrote the death of the Messiah. He also wrote the birth of the Messiah. I got the death as well, and it's also the same length. It's a huge brick of a book. Can you imagine a book like this just on the birth of Jesus? And anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he's got a section, it's not a huge actually, about the responsibility for the crucifixion. And listen to what he says. Frankly, some had advised me against devoting even these few pages on the issue. They have warned me that whatever I write will be dismissed as Christian justification or as inadequate. I would do better, they tell me, to treat the anti-Jewish issue as I treated, he refers to other topics, as very important subjects that lie outside the scope of a book dedicated to commenting on what the Gospels report. This is bullying, period. Nothing more, nothing less. He was basically bullied effectively. People maybe wanted to advise him, not that these were the bullies, but telling him, look, if you get into that, you'll get into all kinds of problems. And look at the two things he highlighted. Christian self-justification. You're not supposed to actually explain, even if you're going to dismiss anti-Semitism, etc., but you're not supposed to put out any Christian self-justification. It's going to be seen as a Christian and not, or inadequate. And what is inadequate in particular is very interesting. There is no end to what is required of you. You're on the defense. You're on the defensive all the time. You have to keep on defending yourself. You are accused directly, indirectly, explicitly, implicitly, and you have to keep going all the time, doing this in order to kind of be accepted, and to people say that yeah, that's okay. But you have to remind them all the time. You have to do this all the time. And this is a very highly regarded scholar being warned actually about talking even in these little terms. And he was obviously a very, against the anti-Semitism, all of that. But he is a theologian. He's not a historian. He isn't going to deny history, but they want history denied. They don't want only theology changed, but they want also history denied. But other people would give them that if Brown doesn't do that. So here's another quote from Crossan, from a different, famous actually study. The often repeated statement that the Jews rejected Jesus and had him crucified is historically untenable and must therefore be removed completely from our thinking and our writing, our teaching, preaching, and liturgy. That is the definition of religion. So now we are in a position whereby, look at how it's understandable if he was kind of attacking, criticizing, accusing all the Jews of the crucifixion. You understand that. That's not what he's looking at, what he's talking about. He's using some absolute, comprehensive, all-inclusive warning. Now, this is what, these two examples, what happens in academia. Should you be surprised really when you are censored by Facebook, Twitter, and these places? This is what I call conditioned and controlled environment. There are people, a lot of scholars, if you go and read, who are dismissed, sacked from their positions just because they went out of line, says something that didn't exactly conform to what they are supposed to say. So now I'm done with the slides. So what is interesting here, I'm trying to link this discussion to what's happening today and what's been happening today. I've given an example of the impact of irrationally seeing anti-Semitism in everything and trying to find anti-Semitism in everything. We see this today in what's happening when you go out and speak against the extermination of the people of Gaza. And my problem is that today we have countless videos, images, eyewitness testimonies, etc., countless such evidence. And then compare this with the situation with the Gospels. We're talking about sources that go back 2,000 years ago. Nobody knows who wrote them, etc. If you have people who are willing to dismiss those countless pieces of evidence today, am I supposed to trust these people when they tell me, when they deal with ancient sources? They look at the video and they don't see it. They look at the image and they don't see it. Am I supposed to trust these people? I mean, the rewriting of the crucifixion responsibility situation started, but 70, 75 years ago, in earnest. Obviously, the roots are older, but that's when it started with Israel and the increasing and unlimited and unfettered support. I mean, the worse the situation gets, the more support America gives Israel. And we ended up in a situation. I think what would be really an interesting project of research is to look at those people, those scholars, famous scholars, who worked on the historical Jesus and went all-out war against anti-Semitism, rightly so, but wrongly by denying what the history say, or what the Gospels say, as in still accepting the Gospels as historical documents, but basically emptying them of their content. It would be interesting to see what they have said and what they've seen in what goes on in Palestine. That would be really very, very interesting to see. So just, I think, to recap here, very quickly, the earliest sources we have, the Gospels and even Paul, but the Gospels really make Jewish authorities and also Jewish mob responsible for the crucifixion. Pilate is only reluctantly agreed to what Jewish authorities wanted and then had Jesus crucified. There's no evidence whatsoever in the Gospels themselves that Jesus had any issue with the Romans had any issue with him, and there is no evidence that the Romans even knew about Jesus until the Jewish authorities introduced Jesus to him with a set of accusation, forcing him effectively to crucify Jesus. So Western scholarship have come now to the point where they've rejected all of that, replaced it with a new history, whereby the Romans are responsible for the crucifixion, the Jews largely exonerated, and that effectively empties the Gospels of their content. If you do that, that's your choice. But if you want to be logical, you have to follow it to the very end and say, I can't now say that he was crucified anyway. To go with that, you can't do all of that and stop at the very end and say he was still crucified. You left nothing, no source, absolutely no detail that is credible as testimony to his crucifixion.
Extraordinary. Well, that's a absolutely extraordinary insight and analysis, I must say. Thank you very much for that. A lot to process. Absolutely extraordinary, and it's interesting how it feeds into the Islamic perspective as well, and the non-historicity of the crucifixion story. Gosh, all right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. As I said right at the beginning, this is unique scholarship. As far as we know, no one else has tackled this subject in this way before. Alhamdulillah, so well done for that. And you are very much an independent scholar who likes to have a unique and fresh look at the historical evidence, and that clearly comes out in your research. So amazing work, sir. Well done.
Thank you, Paul.
And we'll leave it there. So thank you very much. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.